You're listening to The Abundance Agenda, a podcast about growth and progress. I'm James O'Malley.
And I'm Martin Robbins.
This week, how one boat has screwed up a major redevelopment in Bristol for almost 20 years. But first, let's go nuclear. So Martin, I hate to bring him up, but did you follow any of the news from the whole Trump state visit last week?
So I'll be honest, James, I try to ignore pretty much all of it. From what I can gather, there was a lot of conversation about whether Prince Charles was wearing a tuxedo, as the BBC claimed, or if it was some kind of Windsor morning suit or uniform or something. And apparently there was a pink sash, and we weren't sure if Camilla matched it to Prince Charles or Prince Charles matched his ceremonial uniform to Camilla, and Melania Trump was in lots of kind of weird photographs looking like a sort of a floor lamp combined with something out of, The Handmaid's Tale. So, I can't stress enough, I have very limited interest in the state visit as a general topic.
All really important stuff, but the reason I'm talking about it this week is because what you might not have noticed, that aside from all of the parades and the protocol and pretty much, every single British person from the King on downwards putting on probably the bravest possible face in the world, there was actually a really interesting set of policy announcements as well relating to nuclear, which is something we've banged on a lot about on this podcast.
So this is what, Trump threatening to nuke Jimmy Kimmel on Truth Social or something, or more substantial?
Hopefully more substantial than that. So the good news is we're talking nuclear energy, not nuclear weapons. So I think it's safe to say, like I say, we're both fans of nuclear on this podcast because we want energy abundance. My argument has always been just to remind people that we can replace all the fossil fuels, but then do more than that. We can generate way more energy than we already need, and then do innovative, cool stuff with all that extra energy, power data centers, suck carbon out of the atmosphere, desalinate the sea, reduce energy prices. Another thing we can do. You can make energy that's too cheap to meter because we've already invented the technology to do it. It's called nuclear power.
Yeah. So this is the revolutionary idea that if you have more of a good thing, it's good.
Absolutely. You could call it abundance. And this is what's quite interesting about this week. So the big news is that Britain and America have now signed a very exciting memorandum of understanding on closer regulatory alignment, which sounds like the most boring phrase in the world, but is actually really important because it could help us speed up the delivery of nuclear power projects here in Britain.
Yeah, I think listeners will agree this is pretty stirring stuff. We've talked about on the show a lot about how regulatory alignment is incredibly important, because basically otherwise it means that if you want to build a nuclear power plant here, even if you're essentially copying the same designs that have been used in another country, you're having to start from scratch again in terms of what regulators are willing to approve. And this leads to ridiculous situations like conflicts about the exact amount of concrete that you should use over the reactor core in Hinkley Point C, for example, right?
Yeah, it's all just a nightmare of paperwork. It's a huge bureaucratic burden. It's wildly inefficient because it means that, for example, a British regulator, if it hadn't sort of said, we'll just take France's word for it, it might say take a reactor that's deemed safe by, America or France or South Korea or wherever, and say, actually, we want these specific changes like the concrete you mentioned. And it means that every nuclear plant we build has to be this weird bespoke design, and that obviously pushes up the costs. So the idea is, with this alignment deal, with the US at least, is that basically the British regulators will be taking American regulators' word for it, and vice versa. They'll be working together. It's not complete sort of transparency. There will still be a process, but this should reduce it down. So when the American Nuclear Regulatory Commission sign off on a design, it should be able to sort of speed through our Office of Nuclear Regulation. And the big headline is this could apparently cut the time it takes to get stuff approved from sort of 3 or 4 years, as it is now, to around 2, which is good because that's twice as fast.
Yeah, this is excellent stuff, and it's something, just to plug a previous episode, we had the former nuclear minister, Lord Hunt, on the pod at the end of July, and something he was very keen to see happen. But ultimately, so we've got a memorandum of understanding, or an MOU, as they call it in the trade. But is that actually anything? Is it more than just a piece of paper? Is anything actually going to happen?
To be honest, I think it is probably a little bit vague, and I don't think it's got the same full force as a treaty. I mean, but who knows what a treaty means with Donald Trump at this point. But I think directionally, it's a very good thing because it means that a whole bunch more nuclear projects have basically been announced, partially off the back of it, with a whole bunch of American companies getting involved in British nuclear.
Yeah, so we know that like Sizewell C, for example, in Suffolk is almost definitely happening after an announcement this summer that it got funding. Although these announcements are always quite difficult because we keep getting very excited and the government sort of says, hey, we've announced a nuclear power station. It's like, yes, it's one of a series of announcements over 10 years that might eventually lead to something being built. But, in any case, positive stuff. And then, of course, there's the small modular reactor competition that Rolls-Royce beat Hitachi to start working on. So there's stuff starting to come through, but is there anything beyond that that's being announced?
So this is why I think this is actually quite an interesting deal. As if we assume it all pays off and things now happen off the back of it, because Sizewell C and the Rolls-Royce reactor, they're sort of primarily taxpayer-funded things. Okay, it's more complicated than that. I wouldn't say primarily taxpayer-funded, but the government are the ones driving the car on that one. They're saying, we want to build this thing. Can industry build it for us? And the projects that were announced last week, they all appear to be significantly sort of more commercially driven projects. And don't get me wrong, they'll probably still require public money, taxpayers' money to do various, enabling works or tax reliefs. You know how big complex things work, where you have to get the money from different things and twist the government's arms in different ways to get the money. But ultimately, I think this is companies wanting to build nuclear things because it could be profitable in their own right. And that could be good because if we know anything at the moment in Britain, it's that the Treasury doesn't have any money to spend of its own. So if the commercial world can pay for it, then we might actually get some more nuclear stuff happening and actually built, maybe.
So what are some of the specific announcements, James? Come on, educate us.
Okay, so I'm going to name a whole bunch of companies here, which I don't think most people will have ever heard of because they're all very nuclear specific, but they're sort of big deals. So a company called X Energy is teamed up with Centrica, who people will have heard of. They're planning to build 12 advanced modular reactors in Hartlepool, of all places, and that's going to generate, I think, 1.5 gigawatts of energy and power 1.5 million homes, which is cool. And then there's a team up between a company called Holec and Tritax. Again, I don't know where they get these names from. And then EDF Energy, the French energy company that we actually are familiar with in this country. They're now working on a small modular reactor in Cottam. This is one of these experimental, it's not full size, not Sizewell C size. This is a smaller thing like the Rolls-Royce reactor. They're trying to build that in Cottam, which Google Maps tells me is apparently just outside of Preston.
Yeah, and these are great locations as well, right? I think when people complain about the costs of nuclear, often they kind of forget that the money's being invested in jobs and infrastructure in parts of the UK that do really need levelling up, or, in the case of Hartlepool, levelling. So it's quite a good thing for these places, and this is why you often see quite strong public support around the places that nuclear power stations are built.
Yeah, and I think many of these projects are being built on the sites of existing power stations that are being closed down, like coal power stations and things like that. So I guess it's like people there, they're already used to living quite close to a power station.
Bathing in the warm glow, anyway.
So just to finish the list of companies that no one has ever heard of who are building things, Martin, Urenco and Radiant, they're building an advanced fuel facility somewhere to make nuclear fuel, I guess. That's going to be somewhere in Britain, hopefully. And then TerraPower and KBR. No idea either. They're going to be conducting a study to evaluate sites suitable for a natrium advanced reactor tech, which I'm sure nuclear people listening will be very excited about.
Fascinating stuff. I'd say that the studies are a little bit less impressive, the prototypes, but at least it's a step in the right direction, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think directionality is the thing here, and it's all going in the right direction. It appears that Britain is finally building some nuclear stuff, and if this regulatory alignment deal can help us get American companies involved in building stuff and building their reactors and building their designs and hopefully doing it for a bit cheaper than Sizewell C and the like, then that can only be a good thing for us. And Martin, there was one other deal that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's for a very, very special reason. So the other big announcement was there's an American company called Last Energy. They make micro-scale modular reactors. They've done a deal with DP World, who are the company that operates ports around the country, including the London Gateway Port on the Thames, which is one of the biggest ports in the country, if not the biggest. And like I say, they've basically come up with this idea for a mass-producible micro-scale nuclear reactor. So this spits out, I think, 20 megawatts of power when it's built. So that sounds like a lot to me as a layperson, but compared to Sizewell C, it's basically nothing. Sizewell C is like 3.2 gigawatts. Even the Rolls-Royce SMR that's being built, that's going to be 470 megawatts. So this is a much smaller scale thing, but it's going to be used specifically for powering the port directly. It's not going to go into the grid. It's just going to plug directly into the port and help power port operations there.
Fantastic. And of course, the big controversy about small modular reactors is they still can't fit in my attic, James. It's still just a bit too big, sort of football pitch kind of scale, which means I'm stuck with solar for the foreseeable future, much to my annoyance. But I guess microreactors, they're not quite getting to house sized, but they're getting a lot closer to that dream, right? It's the sort of stuff that you could put into a data center or a pulse or an airport and power like a nice area in a self-sufficient way.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea. I think it's a bit like out the Jetsons or that sort of retro futuristic thing where everyone's got a nuclear reactor just out back. So like you say, you could have it so in the future, if these things take off, maybe it could be that every sort of major factory or every large business park has its own little smaller micro reactor powering it, which would I suppose that'd be quite good for resilience, because it means at the moment with nuclear power stations or any power station, you've got this big old thing that if it goes down, it takes out a whole big slice of the country. Whereas if everyone's generating their own power locally or a significant slice of it locally, then that makes us a more resilient country as well. So anyway, I think it's a cool thing. And to find out more about this specific deal, and the reason why this is very special is because this is amazing to me. We've actually got the CEO of Last Energy UK as a guest on our show this week, so stay tuned for that. Michael Jenner is his name. He's had a really busy week last week when we spoke to him. He was, this deal was being done. He was there meeting dignitaries. He was visiting Downing Street. I'm not entirely sure if he was at the palace, but he was definitely like shaking a lot of hands and meeting important people. And yet he took time out of his day to talk to us about the plans and sort of tell us more about what it's like actually on the ground trying to build nuclear in this country, what the sort of political and bureaucratic hurdles are. So stay tuned. Don't press pause on the show to keep listening to that. But first, Martin, we're going to talk about something a little bit different.
So, James, a big thanks to Trevor, one of our listeners, for pointing us to this week's second story. Every so often we come across a story that is just an absolutely bizarre head scratcher of a situation, and this one involves possibly Bristol's most annoying and controversial boat, which somehow has held up the redevelopment of an old warehouse or a pair of warehouses for, as far as I can make out, 18 years.
Sorry, 18 years it's been delaying things, so you could literally have a child, watch it grow up, send it off to university in all the time it's taken, and still this development hasn't happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's old enough to have opinions on Twitter, basically, and it's still not done. So the story starts at the O&M sheds on Welshback. So Welshback is part of Bristol Harbour, right? It's a quay on the River Avon that's been an important dock since around the 14th century. It's called the Welshback because apparently it's where all the Welsh people came when they were coming across to England. And the O&M sheds are a pair of big derelict warehouses, fairly low, a few stories high, that were owned by the council. And at the turn of the century, they're slowly falling into ruin. So the council wanted to redevelop the site as part of their wider regeneration of the harbour, turning it into a hub for leisure and restaurants and trendy wine bars, that sort of thing.
Do you think in 1350 or whatever, the English were getting very angry about all the small boats of Welsh people coming across or something like that?
Almost certainly.
So Martin, so now I guess this must be a pretty city centre location. I've been to Bristol. It's lovely. You're quite close to the water there. You can have a walk around and see some massive old boats, and there's a nice museum down there. So this must be quite a nice location to build some stuff and regenerate.
Yeah, it's a prime location. It's literally walking distance from Bristol Temple Meads station. It's on the harbour, as you say. There's stunning views. There's just one tiny, tiny little snag. And when I say tiny, it's roughly 137 feet long.
Oh, that's actually a surprisingly big boat, Martin. I thought this was going to be like a rinky-dink little canoe or something.
Yeah, so it's a massive Dutch barge that's parked up in the quay, or moored, as I believe it's called in the case of boats. And if you look at reporting from the early 2000s, it's euphemistically described as a local landmark. But we're not exactly talking about the Cutty's Ark, right? It's fairly, an eyesore. It's parked in front of these warehouses, and the council at the time are trying to get developers interested in this plot. But every time they speak to a developer, it's like, yeah, we like the site. Shame about the giant boat that's parked in front of it, kind of slowly disintegrating. Can we maybe do something about that? And so the deals just keep falling through with all these developers.
Martin, I can't claim to be sort of a nautical expert, but I'm pretty sure that boats can move, can't they? Can't they just row the boat or push the boat to somewhere else?
Yeah, so you would imagine that they would just take the boat and move it out of the way and that would be fine. But there's a problem. The boat is inhabited by a local woman, and it turns out that she has a permanent mooring agreement at this exact spot in front of the warehouses. And it turns out that the Ebenezer is a good name for the boat because this woman is a bit of a shark and is not going to be moved without a giant stack of cash. So in about 2007, the council start negotiating. This goes on for about 8 years, back and forth, and by 2015, they're still at a complete impasse.
I'm already thinking about the time. So just to level set on this, 2007, that was what, Tony Blair in power. Everyone had a Nokia. Nobody knew that Donald Trump, this reality star, would soon be the worst person in the world. And yet it's still going on. So that was just 8 years in. And by 2015, you say nothing had happened. That's still a very long time for nothing to happen.
Yeah, and in this time, it's becoming more and more urgent that these warehouses get redeveloped because they're degrading. They're pretty old, like industrial buildings. They weren't built particularly well in the first place. And, by this point, there's a massive crack in one of the walls. And the council are in a bit of a tricky situation because if they can't offload the buildings and get them redeveloped, they're responsible for making sure that they're in a fit state and structurally sound. And that could cost them hundreds of thousands of pounds in repairs. So they managed to strike a deal with Caldwell, who are a property development company based up in Shropshire, I think, who come in and they say, yeah, we'll build a food hall and restaurants and lots of other trendy things for hip young people to go to. And the deal is basically if Caldwell can fix up the building and deal with all of that side of things and pay the costs to make it structurally sound, the council promise, yeah, we'll get rid of that boat. It won't be a problem.
But what you're saying is, at this point, they still don't have an agreement with the woman on the boat to actually move her boat?
No, it's just a tiny, tiny outstanding problem that's currently 8 years in progress. And so they signed the deal with Caldwell in 2017, which is still 2 more years after they start talking to those guys. But of course, now they're in the worst possible position to negotiate because now, if they can't move the boat, not only do they still have to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds to make the building safe, but they've also screwed up a deal with the developer for the site. And A, that means they haven't got a developer anymore. B, it probably means all sorts of legal issues and other problems. So they're now between a rock and a hard place or between a degrading warehouse and one woman. And so this drags on for 2 more years. And in 2019, finally, they hurled just an absolutely gigantic bucket of cash at this woman to get her to leave. And this isn't just for the boat, it's for the permanent mooring rights as well. So it's a fairly large chunk of money.
So how much are we talking, Martin? Because I know when I say to my partner, whenever we're on holiday or whenever we're on a trip or something, we encounter difficulties, I always just say to her, solve the problem with money. If you encounter difficulty, and it's an emergency, just solve the problem with money. So I'm guessing, is that what they did here? How much money did they solve the problem with?
£1.4 million. Which fair play. This was a smart woman who played her hand extremely well, and I hope she's enjoying her new life in Tahiti or Hawaii or the south coast of France, whatever she's done with the cash. Like, what an incredible deal. She should be negotiating for the council, not the other way around.
But where was she during the Brexit negotiations?
Yeah.
It's like, so where are we up to now in the story, Martin? She's got her 1.4 million quid. Is anything being done? Yeah, has anyone started digging anything or shoveling or screwing or I don't know quite what construction terms to use, but surely some work was happening.
Well, so they've still got to move the boat, right? So this is 2019. The negotiations originally started in 2007. So we're now 12 years into this saga and about 5 different councils by this point. And the council now own a boat, which is not something that they ever particularly wanted to do. And not only that, but they haven't really thought about what they're actually going to do with this afterwards. And just to reiterate, this boat is 140 feet long, right? You're not just going to stick it onto a trailer and tow it away somewhere. It's like a whole thing that they've got to deal with somehow.
So could they not just sink the boat maybe and turn it into an artificial coral reef? I've seen lovely videos online of how people will sink boats and then you've got all these little tiny microorganisms swanning about around them.
I mean, that would be a great idea if it was out to sea where, you want a coral reef and not in the middle of a quay in Bristol harbour. But they have various plans, right? So originally they say, okay, we'll just move this a little way up the harbour and we'll turn it into a floating restaurant. But unfortunately, the place they want to move it to is basically in the middle of some houses, like it's a residential part of the quay. And this barge is a massive eyesore. And so there's a huge protest from NIMBYs, which, in fairness to the NIMBYs in this case, I think is fairly justified. Like, nobody wants a 140-foot long boat parked in front of their house that's falling apart. So instead, they're like, well, we don't know where to put it, so we're just going to park it a little bit further up in front of Bridge Quay apartment building, which is home to some of the richest people in Bristol. And it goes about as well as you'd expect. It's almost literally the worst place you can imagine to put this thing if you want to piss off like influential, wealthy people in Bristol. And so the council say, like, it's fine, it's just a temporary thing, it's not a problem. And they say, we're just going to leave it there for a moment. And then we've got a much better idea, which is that we're going to move it to Temple Quay, which is another part of the water next to Bristol Temple Mead Station. And this is a fantastic location. Like, if you put the boat there, it's attractive to developers, so somebody could buy it and develop it, and you've got like maybe a nice restaurant or a bar right next to the station. And there are no residential people around to object to it, so it's a perfect solution, James.
Problem solved. I assume this happened, but this must have happened, Martin. We could go to Bristol right now and go to a lovely bar on the barge.
So it's a nice theory, James, but it's not quite what happened, because it turns out that between Welshback and Temple Quay is Bristol Bridge, and the boat wouldn't fit under the bridge. So then they had to go to plan B, which basically was just to leave this boat parked outside this posh residential apartment building indefinitely.
They fly-tipped a boat.
Pretty much. Exactly that. Yeah. It's like, we can't take it anyway, so we'll just leave it there and just hope nobody notices a 140-foot boat parked in front of Bristol's poshest building.
As I am of the left, Martin, I raise my fist in the air thinking, yes, you stick it to them for being wealthy. But no, so I take it now the boat's out of the way, these warehouses, back to the warehouses, they're getting redeveloped. Presumably they're being brought back to life. Something amazing is going on there. New facilities, new businesses, new restaurants and nightlife opportunities are being created around the lovely Bristol Quay.
Nope. So that's not happening either. So if we rewind to 2017 again, so just after the council have struck the deal with Caldwell, but before they've managed to shift the woman out of the boat and, as you say, in your words, fly tip it, Caldwell put in a planning application for the development, which makes sense because the council have just asked them literally to build a development there, and the council themselves have paid $1.4 million to get the boat out of the way so that this can happen. And so Caldwell put in the planning application, and the council refuse it.
What? Martin, is this a real story or a grotesque parody of the sort of things we talk about on this show?
No, I absolutely promise you. So despite the council's own planning officers saying the development should go ahead, a bunch of elected councillors basically go rogue. They say that the development would detract from the character and appearance of the site, which, let me remind you, is a derelict industrial warehouse that is literally falling down. They say that it could make it harder for boats to moor nearby, despite the fact that there's a 140-foot Dutch barge blocking the entire area that anything could moor on. And they're concerned, best of all, that it might violate the human rights of the woman who lives on the barge, despite the fact that she's about to be made a millionaire.
That's insane, Martin.
Yeah. So the developers now have to go to the government planning inspector, and basically they sue for this thing to go ahead. The planning inspector comes down like a ton of bricks on the council and basically says not only that the development should go ahead, but awards costs against the council. So now, not only have the council paid all this money to move the boat out of the way, they've also been sued by the developers, and now they've been forced to pay costs on top of that to allow this development to go ahead somehow.
The mind boggles, Martin. So please tell me, after all of this, what are we, 18 years on or something like that, you said? After all of this faff, after all this money, please tell me that the building is now finally going ahead, and I want to visit this and see the new bar or whatever the hell they're building in that place.
Yeah, I mean, if it's ever built, I'll take you for a drink there, James. We'll have a pint. The good news is that as of 2025, so 10 years after the deal with Caldwell, 18 years after they start negotiations about this sodding boat, development has finally actually started.
So I think I'm more relieved than anything at this point, Martin, but hang on, where's the boat? We still haven't figured out what the final destination of the boat is. So is that still somewhere? Is that still in front of the apartment building?
Sadly not, James. So the council had big plans for this boat. They were going to turn it into a restaurant at one point, as we've said, or perhaps sell it off to developers to at least recoup some of the millions of pounds that they paid for it. But it turns out that if you own a boat for 5 years and you leave it parked up or fly tips in front of a random residential building and you don't do any work on it or maintenance on it, it falls into a state of disrepair. And in December of last year, 2024, it was finally declared unsafe to be moored at the harbour. And so this put the council in another pickle, which is that, well, we didn't really want to have to do anything with it, but now that it's unsafe, we actually have to dispose of it. So the council have been forced to take it to Albion dry docks, and it's being what we can euphemistically call recycled, i.e. broken down into bits of wood, which apparently the council say are going to be used somewhere else. But, I don't know what they're going to use a load of wet rotting wood for. Maybe they'll come up with something.
So that's 18 years it's took to this point where we've got a development that might just be starting and then a boat that is now being dismantled. That's mind-blowing. 18 years, that's more than 18% of our lives, in all likelihood.
Yeah, and there's still no completion date for the development, right? So fair play to Caldwell for actually sticking around and trying to deal with this at all, because honestly, everybody involved at Bristol Council sounds like a colossal idiot.
But not the woman with the boat, Martin. She's got her 1.4 million quid and she's just laughing.
She's a genius, and honestly, I hope she's living her best life. And if you're out there and you ever hear this podcast, please get in touch. Maybe sponsor us. but like, what a woman! What an amazing story.
Okay, Martin, before we get on with this week's guest, a little bit of housekeeping. So if you're enjoying the Abundance Agenda podcast, then make sure you're subscribed. Go to your podcast app now. Hit the subscribe button if you're not already. Give us 5 stars to review us and feed our massive egos. And yeah, tell people about the show. Send it to a friend. Post it on social media. Say you're a nerdy person who likes shit like this. Have a listen.
So, James, we're both Substackers, as everyone knows. I'm on holiday as people listen to this, so I'm being lazy and not publishing anything. But what are you writing about this week, James?
So last week, I published a piece where I controversially argued, Martin, that racism was bad.
I was going to say, it says in the notes, this week I wrote about racism, and I was curious if you came down on the positive or the negative side, but it sounds like you're firmly against.
Yeah, I wrote about all of the horrible protests and the silent protests and that sort of thing, and the flag waving and the far right, and my big takeaway was racism is bad and we should tell the racists to fuck off. But the argument is slightly more nuanced than that, not that much more nuanced, but you can read that on my Substack. So we'll put links to both of our Substacks on abundancepod.com. But Martin, I'm going to briefly abuse being co-host of this podcast as well to briefly plug a new book. My friend Hayley Gullen's new book is out this week, and everyone should go out and pre-order it and have a read. It's really great. It's a graphic novel memoir of her breast cancer experience. It's called This Might Surprise You, a breast cancer story. Genuinely very moving, interesting, funny book. We'll put links on abundancepod.com. But anyway, now let's get to this week's guest. So as we mentioned, this week we're speaking to Michael Jenner, who is the CEO of Last Energy UK. It's his company that signed the deal this week with DP World to build a new micro-nuclear reactor to power the London Gateway port. So yeah, we thought we'd have a chat with Michael and find out more about the project, how it's being built, and what it's like more broadly trying to develop a nuclear project in this country. So yeah, here's our chat with Michael. So we're delighted to be joined now by Michael Jenner, the CEO of Last Energy UK. Michael, you've had a very exciting week last week. There was a big nuclear announcement. Tell us why it's a big deal for the UK.
Yeah, so it's all part of the presidential visit. There's a whole host of announcements that have gone out on various industries, different pillars of the whole agreement. But for us, it's really important because there was a nuclear agreement, a nuclear part of the discussions. And it's all about how the UK and the US are going to cooperate on nuclear technology. There's some specifics around it. For example, the regulators, to be fair, they've always talked to each other, but now they're going to kind of codify it and formalize it to say, look, we're going to get much better at sharing information and fast track designs, specifically allowing developers to take credit for their work on either sides of the Atlantic. So a company like us, who is going through licensing both in the UK and the US, if you make progress with one regulator, the idea is you should be able to take all or at least a chunk of that progress with you to the regulator on the other side of the Atlantic to move things forward faster. And the upshot of it is that there's an aim to halve the time it takes to get licensing. That's often been 4 years or more. There's a stated goal to try and bring that down to 2, which is fantastic for developers.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because regulatory parity is something that, believe it or not, we talk about a lot on this podcast in the context of nuclear, high-speed rail. We've talked about it in housing, and it's kind of a recurring theme that Britain is often not great at picking up lessons from other regulators or reusing things that have been agreed elsewhere, South Korea, France, etc. So sort of maybe build a picture for us just how much of a project, how far can that sort of set things back trying to deal with those sorts of things?
Yeah, well, I'll talk to you a bit about why we as Last Energy, a US company, was focusing and still is focusing on the UK to be our first build out before we go to other places like the US. And that's because we liked the regulatory regime on the nuclear side in the UK. That's because the ONR, the Office for Nuclear Regulation in the UK, they have a regime which is called a kind of goal setting regime. So they say, look, here's our safety standard, here's the bar. It's up to you as the developer to show us how you meet that. You provide us with your data and your solutions. We'll analyze that. And if you meet it, that's great. Whereas the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US, they've often had a more prescriptive approach where they will say, we want you to do exactly this to meet this target. And that hasn't suited us, because our model is a passive safety model. So we want to be able to say, look, our unit is passively safe so that if anything did go wrong, in the unlikely event anything goes wrong, it has passive safety systems so that it will automatically make sure that it fails to safe. And so we hit the kind of the goals that the regulator set. In the UK, that plays better because of the regulatory regime than the US. So I guess to come back to your point, in the nuclear world, we thought the UK has a more advantageous approach. So that's why we're going here, but it was still slow. And so we've been in some discussions already with the ONR about how we can speed things up. We often use the term, can we please be proportional in terms of the regulatory time that we spend making sure these units are safe? Because our unit's only 20 megawatts, right? So does it make sense that our unit has to spend the same amount of time and money to get licensing than a gigascale unit would? We don't believe that will be the case because the risk is so much lower, for example. So the discussions we've had with ONR have been really fruitful. We don't always agree. We do challenge one another. But for example, we concluded what's called a preliminary safety review where we were it's an initial check that takes forward for a period of time from the ONR. And they said, okay, we've concluded that. We're now into site licensing, and the ONR have said, if you give us the documentation we want, the standard we've agreed, we could give you site licensing by the end of 2027. Now, I recognize if you're not from the nuclear world, that still sounds like a very long time, but that's really fast as far as the nuclear world is concerned. To be able to get the regulators to say, okay, this is a non-binding agreement that we've made, but in principle, if you give us what we need when we need it, when we've agreed, you can get that by 2027. That's fantastic. So we've already seen a lot of movement. So we're hopeful that in the UK, we can build on this now with the agreement in the US and really start motoring. And that's not just for us. We as a company, are very kind of pro-nuclear. So we want other companies who are our competitors. They're different size modules and things like this. But effectively, they're our competitors. We want them to speed up as well because we need this in the UK.
So last week there was a slew of different announcements with nuclear projects all over the country, it seems, but the one that you're working on, it sounds incredibly exciting. You're building an SMR or a reactor next to London Gateway, the big port on the Thames. Can you tell us a bit about this project and what it will mean for the port and the wider area?
Yeah. So, and it might be useful just to differentiate between SMRs and MMRs. So we call ourselves a micro modular reactor because we are just so much smaller at 20 megawatts. A small modular reactor, for example, like Rolls-Royce's unit, is about 470 megawatts. So we call it SMR, but it's actually quite big. So we are just much, much smaller, and therefore the unit itself is physically so much smaller, so we can locate right next to where our industrial demand might be. In this case, it's at London Gateway Port. Now, that's the port on the north side of the Thames in Essex. It's owned by Dubai Ports World, DP World. They've already announced a £1 billion expansion of that port, and that will include 2 new berths, which are fully electrified. And what we mean by that is that they're going to electrify them so that The tractors that take all the goods from the quayside, the distribution centers, they'll be electric. The various cranes that are used, they'll all be electric. And they need power for that. And they need power for the logistics centers that are nearby. They want to decarbonize, but they also want to grow. It's difficult for them to get a connection to the grid. They're in the same boat as everybody else. It's just so congested. So the agreement that we have with DP World is to say, okay, look, a microreactor absolutely fits for what they need. It gives them clean, firm power for their current demand and for their growth, and there will be still be some left over to go out to the grid as well. We're calling it the first port-centric micro-nuclear reactor because DP World obviously have ports in operation around the world. Many of them have quite challenging power supplies in the parts of the world where they're at, certainly challenging in terms of reliability and growth. If this model can be proven in London, it could be put in lots of places around the world to really help growth in areas where it would be much more difficult to get certainly firm, clean power. So it's got a lot of potential for it.
Interesting. So there's really a self-sufficiency aspect there as well, which I don't think people always quite realize.
And when the 1 billion growth package has been put in place by DP World, London Gateway, it's already the largest kind of logistics hub in the UK, but I think it would make it just the largest port as well. So it's a very significant, it's obviously so strategically placed there on the Thames. It would just be great for the UK.
So just to sort of paint more of a picture, will it allow the port to operate completely off-grid? So, if there's a power cut nearby, the port will be able to continue operating. And what makes that a preferable way of doing things rather than, say, putting an extra micro-reactor on the grid, sending all the power to the grid, and then sending that to the port? But you're splitting out the middleman, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. So let me take your first question about could the port operate in what we would call islanded mode if it wasn't connected to the grid. It could, that's feasible, and our units can do that. But almost all of our customers, they want the option of being able to say, look, when we're fully utilizing the demand that comes from the nuclear power plant, that's great, because we've locked that in and we've got it at a locked-in price. But when we don't want to use it, we want to recoup some of that money. Well, you can send it off to the grid. And then if we do that, we recoup some of our costs for the capex of building it, which we can then pass on to our customers. So you can operate certainly in islanded mode. But almost always, if you can get a grid connection, it gives you the ability to send out when you need to. Or, for example, let's just say there's a case where there's another beast from the east and the wholesale price is just so high. You could say to your customer, in this case, it'd be DP World, hey, have you got an interest or an ability to turn down your demand? Because the price is sky high, we can make some money. And in so doing, we help the national grid because obviously that's a signal that we need power. So there's a lot of advantage to it. And then just on to your point, why don't we just locate absolutely anywhere and send across? Well, we can do that as well. You can sign a virtual PPA. So it's a power purchase agreement, but it's just supplied via the grid. The difficulties with that, if you face that, is you still got to find a plot of land somewhere and you still have to find a connection somewhere. And you lose some of the benefits of being able to directly connect to your customer because I don't want to get too technical here, but if you're somebody who's an industry buying power, you say to yourself, right, I've got to pay the wholesale price, then I've got to pay network costs, there's VAT on top of that, and then there's the green levies on top of that. If you're able to get somebody to supply you on your site, you can say, right, I pay for the power, but I don't need to pay for network costs because I'm not using the network. I don't need to pay the green levies because, again, it's not part of the network, so it's a significant saving. So in answer to your question, yes, you can do it. You can locate anywhere and provide power via a virtual power purchase agreement, but there's significant benefits from locating right next to where the power demand is.
So the goal is to have this up and running by, I think, 2030. So in this case, does that mean that the kind of hurdles between now and then are cleared and it's plain sailing, or are there still kind of agreements or planning things that you've got to kind of work through in that period to actually realize the projects on time?
Yeah, so it's all dependent on various things. So we've still got to get permission from the regulator, the ONR. So you'd still need to get the ONR to say, yes, we'll give you the license to be able to build and operate a unit on that site. You also need to get a host of environmental permits from the Environment Agency as well to do that. And in addition to that, you also have to go through planning. Even though this unit is 20 megawatts, so it's small enough to be in town and country planning, we've always had the view that because it's nuclear, that just wouldn't be appropriate. You'd be going for a DCO. It's a nationally significant piece of infrastructure, and that's the kind of planning you need to go through, which means that the Secretary of State has to opine in the end to say this is approved or disproved. So there's a lot of things to go through, and this agreement with DP World is fully dependent on all of that, and we have to work out the final details of the power purchase agreement as well. That's the price that they would pay. So there's a lot to do. But by 2030 aligns with their growth for their gateway and our plans to be, ambitious developer. We're privately funded. We're not using any taxpayer funds. There's no government subsidy here. So we've got to deliver. We can't afford to just push back timeframes and push up costs. So we've got all the kind of incentive in the world to really deliver this.
So one of the key bets with SMRs in general, and I guess it applies to micro reactors as well, is that essentially by reducing these things down, you can get something that's more able to be kind of mass produced and rolled out at scale. And that helps to bring down the costs and also improve areas like safety and kind of efficiency of building, all those sorts of things. So is the hope here basically that this becomes like a cookie cutter approach, that basically you get this built, and from both kind of a regulatory and planning perspective, the contractual perspective, and the technology itself, you can actually then go to other projects and say, okay, we've done this, now we can roll out the same thing in a repeatable way and bring the costs down further?
Yeah, I'm really pleased to hear you use the phrase cookie cutter approach. I often use it and people say, what are you talking about? But that's exactly it. You just basically can cut out a unit again and again. And we've designed the unit so that it goes so far beyond the safety requirements that it wouldn't need to be re-engineered if you put it in different places. Say, for example, you put it in a place that has higher kind of seismic volatility. You wouldn't need to change our unit's design. It's designed so to be over-engineered, so that wherever you put it, you can keep it exactly the same. So we would never go back to the regulator and say, hey, thanks very much for approving this unit. We've tweaked it. Can you approve this one? Because they'd say, well, we've got to do all our work again. So absolutely, we'd keep the unit exactly the same. Even if we found, there's a really more efficient way that could save us a bit, we'd say, no, it's worth it to keep the design exactly. It was safe then, it's safe now, we'll keep it. And we've agreed with the ONR that they fully understand our business model, that we want to build multiple units in multiple sites in a lot of countries in the world. But we've agreed that we're just going to focus on one site to start with, get that across the line, and then we can replicate. So they, as the regulators, would say, okay, we now know what we're dealing with, so it'd be much faster for the next phase of units. Same with the Environment Agency, because they'd understand the model and the permits would be faster. And the hope is it would be similarly sped up for planning, because this unit, you'd be able to come and see the first one and say, look, here it is. You know what it looks like. You know about the sound, the visual amenity and things like that. The whole idea is you do it much more rapidly, yeah.
And is that 20 megawatt figure kind of chosen specifically for that? In the way, this may be a terrible analogy, but it slightly reminds me of drones that are under 249 grams, because effectively the moment you go over that in lots of different countries, you start being exposed to different regulatory regimes or engineering or safety considerations. So was that 20 figure quite critical to that plan?
I wouldn't say it was critical in that sense. You have to take a pitch and say, look, what's an optimal unit? Some companies have said, look, maybe it should be 50, maybe 100. You could see examples of that. We decided, no, we're going to go with 20 because we think the economics works and the kind of proportional regulation works, but we can stack them. So we would say, right, okay, we'd say to a potential customer, we'll build one or two, but the whole point is we've got enough land here for, say, 10. So we will build them as your demand may grow. And that's important for things like data centers, because they often say, look, we'll start off with, 100 megawatts demand, but it's going to be going up. And we can say, okay, we will go up with you. And again, we've discussed that with the ONR. The ONR have said, look, if you're going to be looking at a model like that where you scale up, the best thing to do is to seek a site license for the maximum number you think you could go to, say 10. And then if you build 4, it's much easier. If you say to the regulator, we initially wanted 4, they give you permission, and then you say, actually, I want 6. That's a huge problem for them, because they say, well, now we've got to do a lot of analysis again. So the model we're using is to say, right, we want this many. We might not build that many ever, or maybe in a certain number of years, but we're just future-proofing it so that we can build up.
And I'm looking forward to the future, talking of sort of scaling up. How widespread can this sort of micro-scale reactor generation go? Do you think we could look back in the future in 10, 20, 30 years' time, and every major factory, every major business park has its own micro-reactor there providing energy?
I think that is a possibility, yes. I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of talking to the public and gauging public sentiment before that happens. I mean, we've been talking to the public a fair amount in our kind of town halls. I and a number of my colleagues have been actually talking to people many times just face to face, giving presentations, answering questions. And it's fair to say there's a lot of questions that people have about nuclear. There are some communities in our country who've had nuclear previously, and they're very pro-nuclear. They've often got family members who've worked in it, and they say, look, we want it. We want the jobs. We know they're very well paid. They're lifelong and things like that. But there are probably far more communities who've never seen nuclear before in their lives. They're very nervous when they find that it could be possible that they'll have nuclear near them. They want to know what it means. They want to know, is it safe? It's really interesting just what's in people's minds. When we started to talk to people about locating at some of the sites that we're looking at in the UK, we get questions that we wouldn't have thought. So, for example, does this mean we're a target now, or the unit would be a target for a Russian missile? When that was first asked, I thought, oh, okay, that's probably just an unusual question. It isn't. It keeps coming up. People say, if Britain was ever in a war, does that mean we're going to have a target right near our house? And these kinds of things really need to be talked through, and people need to have that conversation. The standard ones often come up about things like, how is waste going to be dealt with? How can you prove to us that it's safe and things like that? But there are other elements that have come out. So in answer to your question, I think it's very possible in the future that you could see a lot of reactors. They could really boost reindustrialization of the UK, but there's a lot of work to be done. And I think we need to do it as a whole nuclear industry and in partnership with government to have that conversation with communities.
Fantastic. And very finally, so on our show, we're very pro energy abundance. We want more energy than we can know what to do with, because that's where exciting things happen. So from your perspective, what's next in terms of, do you have an ask? So you've been working with government to get the London Gateway project over the line, to get this agreement in place. What do you want to happen next to make life even easier to grow this technology in the UK?
Well, one of the things that we have been floating with government is allowing, so we haven't had any subsidy. We're not involved in that. And it's completely commercial business-to-business transactions. But the nuclear reactors, they're not allowed to bid into the AR rounds of CFD allocation. There's pot 1 and then there's pot 2, which is the kind of more nascent technology, things like tidal technology, which is still first of a kind. Micronuclear, for example, would be the right size to bid into that, to get a CFD, and the strike prices that have been struck on pot 2 of those allocation rounds have been commensurate with what we could accept to build out. So there's a question I've got for policymakers as to why is nuclear excluded from that? It seems to fit perfectly. If you really wanted to build a rapid build out in the UK and take some of the pressure off private investment, you could allow nuclear developers to bid in to the CFD rounds for that. And you could still allow many other projects to be built without the need for that, but having that for some, particularly ones that might be more suited to it, could help the more rapid deployment. And that's something I'm trying to ask policymakers to take a look at right now. But in terms of the regulatory regime and the way things are going, the flexibility, the cooperation with other countries, it's all going well. And I would just say this point, because the UK regulator is held as a gold standard regulator, there are loads of countries looking at the ONR saying, right, if you approve something, we'll take a huge amount of credit for that in our country. So if we can get a license in the UK, there are many other countries, so Poland, Romania, Turkey, for example, who'd say, fantastic, we'll take a lot of credit for that and move you forward rapidly in other countries, so that it becomes a huge export market for the UK as well, which is just great potential. So yes, there's a lot of positive things, but the CFD, taking a look at that, I'd be interested in policymakers having a good think about that.
Fantastic. Michael Jenner, thank you very much. So, Martin, that's just about it for this week's show. But before we go, I do want to follow up on that last thing Michael Jenner said there, because I thought it was really interesting, but he put it in some pretty technical terms. So I think it's worth breaking down what he was saying there about how it could be made easier for companies like his to build out nuclear and what the next sort of future policy thing is.
Yeah, so a few terms there, I guess, that listeners may or may not be aware of, things like CFD, strike price, AR rounds, and I fear you're going to give us a little explainer now, James.
Yeah. So, okay, what he's talking about there, so CFD, that's the Contracts for Difference program. So this is a system that was set up during the coalition years, and it's actually one of the reasons why we've done such a good job as a country so far at decarbonising so much of the grid already. But to wind back a little bit, so basically the problem with energy prices, as we know, they go all over the place. It's largely because of the price of gas. The current price is called the strike price. And it's always changing because, sometimes there's a war or sometimes some geopolitics happens and there's an embargo. But it doesn't really matter. To your kettle, it doesn't really matter where it's getting the electricity comes from. But the price is ultimately set by the sort of marginal commodities. And in this case, that's the price of gas. And this is a really bad thing if you're trying to build out, whether it's renewable energy or nuclear energy or anything like that. Because if you're investing in one of these things, then you're working out how much money you can make from selling energy generated by this new thing. And if the gas price is high, like it was after the invasion of Ukraine, suddenly building out your nuclear plant or your solar panels or whatever, quite lucrative. But then if the price falls, like it did, after fracking was discovered, and it turns out you can get fossil fuel for cheap again, clean energy just doesn't become very profitable. So the Contracts for Difference program, CFD, again created around sort of 2011 sort of time, I think. Basically, this is where the government says, we will buy X amount of energy at a fixed price. And then the renewable providers can all bid in and say, we'll provide this much renewable clean energy for this little money. It's like basically, I think it's like a reverse auction, because basically the companies are saying, no, we can do it cheaper. And the idea is it then creates a whole bunch of certainty so you can go and build your thing. Here's the problem though, and this is why Michael raised it as a thing. So there's two pots of CFD cash. There's one for mature technology, that's your solar farms and that's your wind turbines. We know those, they work. There's a second pot of cash, which is for more sort of experimental stuff like wave power and things. And weirdly, nuclear isn't actually included in this pot of cash. So he can't build one of his microscale nuclear plants and get some of the CFD cash and this guarantee commitment for it, which makes it sort of harder to build out. So his argument is basically he should be able to dip in and bid for some of the contracts in this pot. And I can't claim to be an expert on this. I'm definitely not an economist or anything like that who understands the nuances of this, but it sounds like a sensible change to me. If you know about this sort of thing, why not drop us an email? I'd be very interested to hear about that. But yeah, that's basically what he was saying. And that's why I wanted to leave it in and talk about it, because yeah, that's a really interesting thing. That seems like a relatively small tweak that could be done to maybe help, build out all this nuclear stuff.
Thanks for that explainer, James. And I think that's the end of the show. How do you think it's gone? You usually ask me that, but I'm going to turn the tables.
You have turned the table. I'm very stressed now at coming up with a good answer. No, I think it's been good. I very much enjoyed it. The barge story is still breaking my brain, Martin. We've had some good nuclear chats. So I think if people have enjoyed listening, they should probably tune in again next week when we're going to have basically more of this sort of thing. So in the meantime, go to abundancepod.com, follow all of the links to read our newsletters, go and buy Hayley's book, go and find more abundancepod.com. But for now, goodbye for now, I guess.
See you next week.